Welcome, everyone. I'm Barb Trish, Director of the Rosenfield Program in Public Affairs, International Relations, and Human Rights, and am thrilled to see you here on this beautiful day. It occurs to me that the Rosenfield Program was part of what might have been the last in-person event in March of 2019 before we went remote, and now we're really pleased to be able to be one of the first in person. Hopefully there will be many more to come. I won't take long. I'll just briefly tell you who our panelists are, our teachers are for this teach-in. But just the plan will be they will each talk briefly about a focus that they know individually about. Barry Driscoll will start and give you a little bit of background. And afterwards, I'll have a handheld mic. If you have a question, I'll come to you and you can pose the question to the panelists. My plan is to close by 12:45 so you all can get to where you need to be for a 1 o'clock class. Fingers crossed that the sound system will work. Grab me, holler, and if it's not working, we'll figure out what we can do. So, you have in front of you Professors Sharon Quinsaat from the Department of Sociology, and then 3 in a row, political scientists, Professor Barry Driscoll, Wayne Moyer, and Danielle Lussier. And Professor Driscoll will begin.
Thanks, Barb, and good afternoon, everybody. So, as we're all aware, earlier this year, Burma's military overthrew the incoming democratically elected government led by the Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi. The fact that there was a military coup was not in itself all that remarkable. What was more remarkable was that it was the military who were the ones who had drawn up the constitutional arrangement that they had then overthrew. And just a few years ago, Aung San Suu Kyi and her party had won another election, and the military didn't stand in her way. So this came as a really great surprise to a lot of observers. So my job is to give us a 5-minute crash course in the country's history and offer some thoughts along the way from a political science perspective. So, big picture. Burma gets its independence from the British just after World War II. And even by the standards of 19th century empires, British colonial control of what was then Burma was extraordinarily coercive and brutal. And the way in which the British governed Burma separated groups into ethnically and geographically distinct zones. And not only that, the British privileged some of the ethnic groups over others. So, for example, the majority Burmans, from which we get the name Burma, they were significantly underrepresented in institutions such as the military. By the time World War II rolls around, the British and the Japanese are arming different ethnic groups in Burma, and ethnic groups, while nominally fighting against the British or the Japanese aligned, are also launching attacks against one another. So, in this exceptionally diverse political community, what happens is the country gets independence in 1947, but immediately there are a range of ethnic groups that do not accept the new independent constitutional arrangement. This is why people say that Burma was born into civil war, because it had civil war right on its eve and has continued to have a significant amount of conflict ever since. It has some of the world's longest running insurgencies. Even before the coup of just a few months ago, the government probably didn't control about a third or so of its own territory. That's even before the coup. So the military that's in the news today took power in various forms in the 1960s and governed all the way up until about shy of a decade ago. Now that is also quite significant. Generally speaking, military regimes don't last that long. especially when the military regimes do so spectacularly poorly at raising people's living standards. So this is also quite unusual from a comparative perspective. It's shocking just how durable the military regime was. Then, about a decade ago, the military regime began to liberalize economically and politically, and in other respects, especially with relation to the media. But what's notable now is that the military appeared to liberalize on their own terms, which is to say, as far as we can tell, there was no significant pressure on them to liberalize the political space. That's also very unusual for the military. And when we observe military regimes, when they democratize, they do so to hold on to power, but they do so in the face of significant pressure. The regime apparently did not have this pressure, and it's still a little bit of a mystery as to why they did democratize. But the constitution that they introduced about a decade ago gave them an extremely sweet deal, which is to say they gave themselves an extremely sweet deal. They got to control a quarter of the parliament. They got complete autonomy on matters of security. They got to set their own budget. They didn't have to have the annoyance of day-to-day running of an actual country. And they could pursue the violent suppression of ethnic groups elsewhere in the country as they pleased. So this was very much a sweet deal for them. And in terms of the individuals in the military regime, they were significant recipients of foreign investment. So it appeared to be a very sweet deal that they had set up for themselves. Why then they overthrew it a few months ago is still a little bit unclear. Nevertheless, there was this opening of an economic and political space about a decade ago. The US removed sanctions. The country had been one of the most sanctioned in the world probably since the mid-1990s and a little bit longer. And I can say a little bit more if people are interested on the question of sanctions. We come then, and I'm going quickly, we come then to 2015 when Aung San Suu Kyi and her party won the general election, and the military honored the results. From 2015, we saw this liberalization of political and economic spaces really take off, and we saw an explosion in formal civil society or non-governmental groups, in particular in areas such as women's rights, environmental rights, rights of workers, defense of free speech, and so forth. So, on the eve of the coup a few months ago, many people looked back at the 2010s and saw it as a period of significant hope for many in Burma, which is to say that it was a period of relative stability, relative prosperity, not, of course, for the Rohingya, but for the majority, as far as we can tell, for the majority of Burmese, people were quite aspirational and optimistic just on the eve of the coup. So we get then to the end of 2020 and the governing party wins re-election, but they did so with an even greater landslide than people had been expecting. In January, the government was about to take up seats in Parliament. I think they were literally about to sit down in Parliament, and the military arrested the government and shut off the internet and said that they were back in power. So initially, in the days after the coup, the military allowed for protests to happen, and what we saw was a significantly significant breadth of civil disobedience, not only from students but also from bankers, health professionals, engineers, and I thought most notably civil servants themselves, people who depend on governments for jobs. As this went on for a few weeks, we saw that the economy started to grind to a close. ATMs started to run dry, banks were closed, hospitals were closed. There were weeks of economic collapse. Gradually then, as the weeks went by and as the military had shut off the internet, people who had money in their mobile phones found that they couldn't access their own money. So people's daily lives ground to an excruciating halt. And I can talk a little bit more about the political economy of both the eve and the eve of the protests and more recent weeks. So let me wrap up. After initially tolerating the protests, the military, as we've all seen, began to, in extraordinary fashion, terrorize the population. Many of the troops that you've seen on the streets were those who had initially been in more remote areas suppressing ethnic rebellions, including, for example, the Rohingya population. So the troops that are being brought into urban areas with heavy equipment are troops who are no strangers to extreme violence. So I'm going to pause there, and I think, Sharon, Danielle?
Thank you. I'm going to add a little bit more from a slightly different perspective. I'm going to try to put what's going on in Myanmar into the lens of regime change, and throwing a little bit more sort of political science theory behind some of this. So just to give you a quick definition, when I talk about regime, I'm talking about the rules and procedures that determine access and distribution of power. And those are both written rules, so things that are constitutionally vested, as well as the informal norms that govern how those actual written policies are put into place. And so when we think about democracy, democracy is an example of a political regime. It's not the only kind of political regime. And while we frequently associate elections with democracy, it's really important to understand that most non-democratic regimes in the world today use some form of election to legitimize their political power. And so when we think about the process of democratization and what it means for whether or not a country currently has a democracy, we need to look beyond elections. And so often we think about this, what scholars of comparative politics think about is there being two big dimensions of democracy: civil liberties and political rights. And so when we think about civil liberties, we're thinking about things like freedom of expression, access to alternative sources of information, the ability of the media to report and for people to read what the media is reporting, and the ability to organize. So the ability of different citizens to develop their own organizations. This is the exact sort of liberalization that we'd seen dramatically improve in Myanmar over the past decade. When we talk about political rights, we talk about fair and free and frequent elections, and later on we can talk a little bit more about what makes an election fair and free. But there are a few other political rights that I think need to be underscored that are sometimes overlooked. So the first one has to do with political control actually being vested in the hands of elected officials. So you can have elections that might bring certain people to power, but if those who control the levers of political power are non-elected, then you do not have a democracy. A second piece, and this is sort of an implicit assumption, it's very implicit, but it's really important, is that the military is under civilian control, that the military does not have political decision-making power, but that the decisions that are being made by any government about the military is separate. So it's a separate decision-making apparatus. And then the third piece that we think about in the modern era, so this is very much a modern definition of democracy, is nearly universal suffrage. So broad-based citizen access to participate in politics. And so when we think about this, I want to say, from my perspective, in spite of the fact that Myanmar experienced some very meaningful political liberalization over the past decade, it has never met the threshold to be called a democracy. And even the 2015 elections, which were by far the fairest and freest that ever existed in the history of the country, they do not meet the procedural minimum to be called a democracy. And I'm going to explain a little bit why. And this goes back to the 2008 Constitution, which continues to be operative in Myanmar. It was organized by the military, and it vests very considerable power in the hands of the military. So specifically, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces has very broad powers. He controls what are considered the power ministries of the government, so the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Border Affairs, and he's selected through a non-democratic appointment process. The second piece, as Professor Driscoll already mentioned, 1/4 of the seats in the legislature are appointed by the military. So they're not even up for election. And that appointment is by the Commander-in-Chief of the military. And then the third is the process by which the president is elected. So the president comes out of the legislature. It's not a directly elected presidential system. And the military gets to appoint one of the 3 candidates. And then each house of the legislature appoints the other 2 candidates. And whoever loses becomes vice presidents. So you have this situation where you always have shared power with the military within the executive. And then the third sort of piece that I'll add about this, or before I move on, I want to say that all 3 of those things I just mentioned, those are examples of what we would call tutelary interference. Examples of a non-elected entity interfering with the decision-making power of the government. And then a third piece, and this ties into also with the historical context that Professor Driscoll gave us, has to do with that broad access to the political space. So in 1982, there was a citizenship law that was established that does not allow for anyone who entered the country or is descended from someone who entered the country after 1948 to become a full citizen with the ability to participate in elections. It has a very narrow definition of citizenship that ultimately leads to the exclusion of Aung San Suu Kyi. They had to create a special position for her in 2015 because she was not actually eligible to run for president under their citizenship law. So leading up to the most recent coup, as Professor Driscoll mentioned, we had this November 2020 election for parliament in which the National League for Democracy performed very, very well. But in contrast to the 2015 election, there were a number of very severe violations in this election in 2020 that I think are relevant. COVID precautions, and this was the case globally. So we saw in general a global decline in democracy in the past year because of restrictions on movement as a result of the pandemic. But it led to a prohibition of in-person campaigning. So it made it much harder for parties that were not already part of the political system to gain access to campaign. Existing rules allowed for the exclusion of many Muslim candidates and the disenfranchisement of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya. And the Union Election Commission, so their electoral governing body, canceled voting in many conflict areas where they were experiencing violence. That led to more than about 1 million citizens out of an adult population of about 35 million from not even being able to participate in voting at all. And there was also intermittent shutdowns of the internet and limited media coverage throughout 2020. So this just made it much, much harder for the elections to even come close to what we saw in 2015. And so for my concluding remark on this would just be that while the liberalization that Myanmar experienced over the past decade allowed members of the National League of Democracy and other parties to gain some access to the legislature, the constitutional order was not changed, and consequently the military was never removed from political power. It had the opportunity to always engage in this political constraint, and simply just decided once the NLD became a bigger threat to them I would say in the past several months, that it was time to reassert power. I think I turn over to Sharon now.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to Barb for inviting me. So I'm going to focus on the movement itself. Okay, we discussed this in my seminar. Actually, my students are here in regimes and resistance, and then they could add, but this is basically what we talked about in class. So we have to understand the contemporary uprisings that influenced this present one. Okay, so the first one is the August 8, 1988 uprising, the 4/8, 8/8/88. I'm going to go over very quickly with 2 movements that influence, because the protesters and the military are learning from these 2 uprisings that happened. So the 8/88 uprising, hundreds of thousands of protesters led by universities, movements, university students mostly, threatened to unseat the regime. So revolutionaries often started there's a spark that is very trivial. Okay, so the 8/88 uprising started because of a brawl at a tea house, and then the military killed a young student. Because of this, that sparked it. So it's mostly university students, especially in Yangon and Mandalay. Students succeeded in disrupting daily life and then continued to draw more people to their cause with increasing pro-democracy, anti-government slogans. But the authorities, the Tatmadaw, which is the military, declared martial law. There was curfew. They adapting it now to 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. And in September 18, soldiers just began firing towards the protesters. These are mostly students. They also closed the university so that the students will not be able to congregate because this is mostly student-led. And then, of course, like September 21, it was the massacre, the carnage. At least 3,000 protesters were dead. Okay, so you have to understand also the Tatmadaw will open fire at protesters. They're warning shots, but then they're going to open fire. 2007 came, the Saffron Revolution, as what they call, based on like the color of the monks' wardrobe. Although it's not really saffron, I don't know about colors, but anyway. Again, the spark was, the fivefold increase in the price of fuel. Okay, many protested this because it's just hard for them. A lot are living in poverty. But what kind of like emerged as the main actor are the Buddhist monks. This is because, with the people's ability to donate food, to the Buddhist monasteries greatly diminished, they also had a hard time, the Buddhist monks themselves. So even like citizens, many of them poor, they were unable to send their children traditionally to the monasteries to be fed. So a mission that monks could no longer perform. So this desperation, of course, among the monks sent them to the streets as early as August 19, 2007. This is a relatively small, peaceful, and silent demonstration in Yangon, still to protest price increases. Still, like, not so much like pro-democracy calls, but it was still related to what we call like economic grievance, right? All in all, in 2007, the regime acted with noticeably more restraint than in 1988, although it is important to stress that, the challenge to the regime during that time, 2007, was very modest compared to 1988. No entirely like casualty figures, a lot of crackdown, death toll was like lower compared to 888. There were disappearances, 74 disappearances, and there's just one Japanese press photographer who was killed. And so fast forward to 2020, this spark is of course a coup. So it's no longer like, this like tea room brawl that eventually led to pro-democracy calls, price increases that led to pro-democracy calls. But this is like it's very clear to people this is an assault on democracy, right? So there was that major actor is what they call the civil disobedience movement. So what they did is really to learn from these two uprisings that failed. Okay, they were considered failure in terms of like unseating the regime. So they said like, what failed in 888? So they said it failed because these are mostly students. These are mostly students that the government could just shut them down, the universities, and they did. They have no way of influencing, of course, like policy. They weren't considered a threat. And then the monks were not considered as threat as well. And so in this movement, the civil disobedience movement is learning, saying that we need to identify the vulnerabilities of the regime. So what is the vulnerability of the regime? It's largely economic. If we are going to withdraw our labor power, it's not going to sustain the regime. And this is why the civil disobedience movement was largely a worker-led movement. So after the coup, a massive civil disobedience movement emerged. Workers and trade unions were front and center. So medical workers, 110 hospitals. Like imagine it's a time of pandemic, like medical workers are not going to work. One government hospital, 38 out of 40 doctors and 50 out of 7 nurses struck. So massive strike everywhere. Trade union federations were quick to mobilize. Confederation of Trade Unions, largest trade union in Myanmar, first general strike February 8. You have these are the sectors I'm just going to enumerate: garbage collectors, firefighters, electricity workers, private bank employees, garment workers. So because the regime relies so much, of course, on these workers to run the government. So think about it, of course, from a Marxist perspective too. And also the garment workers, trading, for example, like H&M, many of these, like what you're wearing right now, they're produced in Myanmar. So they realized that, with the workers striking, it will really cripple the regime. Teachers were there too, the 100,000 strong Myanmar Teachers Federation. Journalists, they've been walking off the job in response to the coup and threats to media freedom. Members of the Myanmar Press Council and more than a dozen journalists, have resigned. Importantly, as what Barry had said, employees from municipal governments and ministries, commerce, electricity, energy, transport and communication, railway, for example. So striking workers everywhere, even from Myanmar oil and gas enterprise, because the state controls so many of these industries. And so, as I mentioned, garment workers were among the first to call the street protests and mobilize industries. I'm quoting one labor organizer. He said, the sight of industrial workers, largely young women garment workers, seems to have deeply inspired the general public, broken down some of the fear, and catalyzed the massive protests and general strike we are seeing now. So in terms of strategies, what does this CDM do? So they strictly maintain nonviolence, of course, like I said, like non-cooperation, withhold their labor power. But they were also very creative, and this is mostly because of the younger generation too. Like cars in Yangon, for example, would move very slowly, creating huge traffic jams so that workers won't be able to go to work. There's that cars mysteriously breaking down in the middle of the road, so they would just stop there and oh, my car broke down, and then the police or the military would go there, and they're like, okay, then what are we gonna do? People won't be able to go to work. There are street murals projecting images as well on walls. They also adopted from movements in other countries, like the Hong Kong uprising, the Lennon walls. So in Yangon, there would be posted in this huge wall where they would put their grievances. There are also, if you've read about the cacerolazo, for example, the banging of pots and pans, very coordinated at 8 p.m. It started in February too. And then, of course, they're drawing from popular culture. And again, this is because the youth also were very much involved in the creative tactics. Like, for example, the three-finger salute, right, from the Hunger Games gesture was first used not actually in Myanmar, but in Thailand in 2014, and has since come to stand for solidarity among all pro-democracy resistance across the region. And then the activists say that they were asked, why are you using this? And then they said, oh, it could be easily understood to represent concepts of freedom, equality, solidarity. And they said the youth, one activist they interviewed said, well, the anti-authoritarian messaging conveyed in the Hunger Games really resonated with us, And then there was the Milk Tea Alliance. Again, drawing from popular culture, the alliance has united campaigners pushing for greater democracy in the region. It emerged last year, actually in China, I think, Chinese nationalists. And then it gained popularity again in Thailand, Hong Kong, Taiwan. And the hashtag Milk Tea Alliance has more than 11 million tweets. This is when I just saw this morning. Okay, so what then is the military going to do, right? They have adapted their strategies, mostly worker-led. We have to think about the political history of independent Burma, as what Barry already covered, is the history of its armed forces, Tatmadaw. So even the military propaganda, it says that only if the armed force is strong will the nation be strong, and the Tatmadaw is the mother and father of the people. So this is deeply ingrained, in terms of ideology, to all Myanmar people in Myanmar. So one of the most important reasons for the army's violent response to demonstrations was that they're really scared that it might cause splits within the military. They have to maintain many military still loyal to the Tatmadaw, because we've learned that military defection has brought down a lot of dictators and regimes, right? Nonviolent revolutions, from like the Philippines to East Germany to everyone. Like if the military doesn't shoot anymore, like the protesters, then you have that power of the people. And this is why, for example, the Tiananmen massacre, like what happened is that it brought a lot of the military from the rural areas who had no relations, for example, to the people in the capital. So to make sure that they are still going to shoot the protesters who are their neighbors, etc. So Tatmadaw relied on 3 key strategies, like what they did, like in the last 2 uprisings, 888 and 2007, framing protesting as rioters. Military deployed agent provocateurs. They would arrest protesters before daylight. They just make them disappear. But one thing that is very recent that we didn't see in 888 and 2007 is the military suppressing through social media. So they created social media accounts, this time to monitor, infiltrate, and spread disinformation. And it started, of course, in 2017 during the Rohingya crisis and also like the general election. So it's very crucial for us to look at the ways like the military adapt their repressive tactics, but at the same time, the movement players, the protesters are also adapting. So it's an interaction. I always tell my students this, not just look at the social movement actors, but how is the state responding to the protesters? Okay, thank you.
I'm going to try to put Myanmar in a broader international context. I would like to tell you that the international community will come to the aid of the people of Myanmar in preventing the gross human rights abuses that have taken place since the coup. However, I think that is highly unlikely in a world experiencing the revival of great power geopolitics. There was a period after the end of the Cold War, particularly after the 1994 Rwanda genocide, when we were hopeful that international action could be taken to prevent and stop atrocities. There were several successful multilateral humanitarian interventions in the 1990s, including Bosnia, Kosovo, and East Timor. A UN summit of world leaders unanimously approved a document affirming the right to protect in 2005 to protect populations from atrocities. The right to protect has had some effects in civil wars in Africa, but it's almost impossible where the great powers have conflicting interests. Myanmar is such a place. The competition between India and China for influence in Southeast Asia makes both countries reluctant to break ties with the military leaders of Myanmar, which in turn makes them downplay the seriousness of the oppression in Myanmar. Both countries have economic investments in Myanmar, and both have provided military assistance to the military regime. Russia has also provided arms to the military regime in Myanmar, and Putin is always looking for opportunities to increase Russian influence. After the coup, he sent his deputy defense minister to Myanmar to reassure the military leaders. Russia and China, as you know, are permanent members of the UN Security Council, which so far have prevented the Council from taking effective action, and will probably continue to do so in the future. The US, though it has imposed sanctions against the military leaders, does not have the economic clout to force the military leaders to change their policies. After interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, U.S. military action is out of the question. I think the best hope for coordinated international action comes from ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries. ASEAN has enough economic interplay with Myanmar that it could apply significant pressures on the generals. But I think unified action is unlikely. Even though the democratic members of ASEAN, including Indonesia and Malaysia, although one might argue how democratic Malaysia is at the moment, they've been critical of the Myanmar regime. But the authoritarian governments in Thailand, Vietnam, and Cambodia have been notably silent. And we know that the military regime in Myanmar has very close ties to the military regime that is dominating in Thailand. Personal ties, as well as political ties. The government repression in Myanmar has generated a large number of refugees who are fleeing to neighboring countries, creating more instability in the region. But the domestic effect in these countries is uncertain. Will the increased instability strengthen the trend toward authoritarianism? Or more hopefully, will it galvanize ASEAN to pressure the Myanmar regime to restore civilian government and end the atrocities? Unless there is coordinated international action, I think it is unlikely that the Myanmar regime will end its repression. The military has lost legitimacy with the Bamar majority population, and civil war may ensue, with the leaders of the protests joining up with ethnic groups living on the fringes of Myanmar who have been in continuous war with the military. I think the risk is very high of civil war and that Myanmar will become a failed state, somewhat analogous to Syria.
Thank you. Thanks to the four of you for taking an impossible task of speaking briefly and making it possible and very interesting. Thanks so much. If I can figure out how this microphone works, I can bring it to you if you have any questions.
Does this work? Okay, great. Thank you so much. My question is mainly focused on the possibility of having of returning to maybe the democratic liberalization that existed until the point of this coup, and mainly through the lens of Aung San Suu Kyi. And I think my question is kind of, is there a reality, do you think, where Aung San Suu Kyi or someone like her is able to toe the line between having an international recognition of civil liberties and human rights, but also playing to the military in some respects? And so not exactly throwing the military off power, because I don't know if that's entirely possible, but having somewhat of a middle ground between that, where civil liberties keep increasing, but the military doesn't feel threatened. Do you think that's a possibility of that happening?
I'll hand it over to you in a moment, Danielle, if you want. My own sense is that people outside of Myanmar have overestimated how concerned Suu Kyi is with the liberal part of liberal democracy. Journalists and government opponents have still been thrown into jail in the last few years, And not even if we don't look at the question of the Rohingya, Aung San Suu Kyi in power did not appear to be what we would expect from a Nobel Peace Prize winner. So my guess is that the military, sort of as Danielle said, realized they probably gave away a little too much and they want to redo the constitution, and there's no way in which they have elections in which she doesn't take a lot of power because she's extraordinarily popular. The only question for me is whether the military has miscalculated and this whole thing spins out of control before they can get back to a new constitution, new elections. I actually do think they want new elections. They just want them under new auspices that they control. But as to Aung San Suu Kyi, my hope is, let me recap. I would say that if there is a more liberal democratic Myanmar in a few years' time, it will not have been because of the human rights impulses of Aung San Suu Kyi.
I'll just add a tiny bit to that, to say I think there is a greater criticism of her within Myanmar than is often we are often aware of outside. And this ties precisely to the turn in 2017 to dramatically repress the Rohingya population. That Aung San Suu Kyi has gone on record saying she did not think that human rights violations took place, that she did not consider this ethnic cleansing, and there's a lot of evidence that suggests that is simply not true. Now, there's debates about why. I mean, there are some people who I would say, people not myself, who this is all secondhand from what I've read, but scholars who say that she was basically forced at that moment to either basically come out and criticize these decisions that were probably imposed to a certain degree by the military with whom she had to cohabitate in power, and basically lose her ability. She would be thrown out of the government, or had to make a compromise and say, I'm going to try to stay within this cohabitation situation. I have no idea if that's true, but that's an argument to be made. And so I think we need to look beyond Aung San Suu Kyi and what she is able to do. She's discredited herself for better or worse in the current situation. If anything, though, I would say the one thing now, though, is that she's back under house arrest. She's out of power, and that can, to a certain degree, could create some possibilities for galvanizing around her.
Can I just add, I don't think she's discredited herself. She's discredited herself to international audiences and to a small number of Burmese intellectuals. I think we can forget how she genuinely is, as far as we can tell, extraordinarily popular. And the Rohingya occupy the slightly different place in the popular culture, or excuse me, the political culture of Myanmar, which is to say that the majority of the population, as far as we can tell, do not consider them to be even Myanmar. They're considered to just be Bangladeshis who've overstayed their welcome. And my understanding is that she genuinely believes this. So yes, she was forced into a corner and had to cohabit with the military, but I think it is also the case that I don't think what she said in international forums about the Rohingya was causing her a lot of angst. I think she genuinely believes it, because it is a very popular view in Myanmar.
What a terrific way to end on a disagreement between Barry and Danielle. And we are out of time. Thank you all for coming. Good luck. Best of wishes to the class of 2021, and hope to see the rest of you in the fall. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.